There are many ways to run from a war, but escaping a battlefield does not always mean escaping what the war leaves behind inside a man. And for Jeremiah Johnson, leaving the world did not bring peace so much as it brought silence. A silence vast enough to finally hear the weight of everything he carried with him. He was not a man chasing glory, or fortune, or the kind of freedom promised in frontier legends, but a man who had simply seen too much, who had returned from the Mexican-American War to a civilization that felt loud, hollow, and strangely unfamiliar, a place where faces moved quickly and words felt thin, and where progress seemed to march forward without remembering who it trampled beneath its feet. Jeremiah Johnson did not announce his departure, did not explain himself, and did not look back for long, because the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than reason, in the part of him that could no longer endure crowds, expectations, or the quiet violence of ordinary life, and so he turned west, toward the Rocky Mountains, not to conquer them but to disappear into them. He carried with him a rifle, a few supplies, and a head full of ideas that belonged more to stories than to reality. Ideas about wilderness as a refuge, about solitude as healing, and about strength as something earned simply by enduring hardship, believing, as many men before him had believed, that surviving war had somehow prepared him for surviving nature. What Jeremiah did not yet understand was that the mountains do not recognize courage, nor do they reward suffering for its own sake, and that they are entirely indifferent to intention, reputation, or past heroics, offering instead a quiet, relentless test in which every mistake is counted in cold, hunger, and time. When he first arrived, he believed the land would provide if he worked hard enough, that a cabin built by his own hands would be enough to keep the winter at bay, that meat hung to dry and firewood stacked in neat piles would see him through, and that his instincts, sharpened by war, would guide him safely through whatever came. This belief, gentle and dangerous, nearly killed him. The first winter in the Rockies came slowly at first, almost politely, with shorter days and colder nights. But it did not stop, and it did not soften, and it did not soften, and it did not care that Jeremiah Johnson was new to this world, because snow began to fall in steady silence, covering trails, swallowing landmarks, and turning the mountains into a vast white expanse where direction itself became uncertain. His cabin, built where it felt right rather than where it needed to be, leaked heat into the wind. His woodpile vanished faster than he had imagined possible, and his food stores, calculated with optimism rather than experience, dwindled until each meal became smaller, quieter, and heavier with consequence. The cold was not dramatic, not sudden, but patient, creeping into joints, slowing thought, and turning simple movements into careful negotiations with pain. And as days blurred together under a sky that seemed endlessly pale, Jeremiah found himself trapped, not just by snowdrifts and frozen ground, but by the realization that everything he thought he knew had been wrong. He had faced death before, under gunfire and chaos, surrounded by other men and noise and motion, but this was different, because here death came quietly, without warning or witnesses, sitting beside him in the long nights, waiting patiently as the fire burned low and the silence pressed in. There were moments when hunger twisted his thoughts into something sharp and unfamiliar, when the howling wind felt almost like a voice, and when the stillness became so complete that it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing, leaving only him behind, a single fragile life in a vast frozen system that would continue with or without him. Jeremiah Johnson survived that first winter, but not because he was strong or brave or prepared, but because chance allowed him to survive, because instinct refused to let him lie down and stop, and because the mountains, for reasons of their own, did not take him that year. When the snow finally receded and the world revealed itself again, he emerged thinner, slower, and profoundly changed, no longer carrying the quiet confidence of a man who believes he belongs anywhere, but the humility of someone who has learned painfully that survival is not about dominance, but about precision, patience, and respect. This was the first lesson the Rockies gave him, and it would not be the last. When spring finally returned to the Rockies, it did not arrive as a celebration but as a quiet release, the snow retreating slowly from the valleys, revealing a land that looked unchanged and yet felt entirely different to the man who had barely survived it, because Jeremiah Johnson was no longer the same person who had entered the mountains months before. He moved through the thawing landscape carefully now, with the caution of someone who had learned how close the edge truly was, aware that every decision he made carried weight, that every shortcut hid a consequence, and that the mountains did not forgive ignorance, no matter how honest it might be. It was during this fragile season, when survival still felt uncertain and confidence had not yet returned, that Jeremiah sought out other men, not out of camaraderie or conversation, but out of necessity, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that isolation without knowledge was not strength, but recklessness. Among these men was an old trapper known as Bearclaw, a figure who seemed less like someone living in the mountains and more like someone shaped by them, his movements slow but deliberate, his voice calm, and his presence carrying the quiet authority of a man who had survived things he did not speak about. Bearclaw did not offer comfort, nor did he offer encouragement, because the wilderness had taught him that neither were useful, but what he did offer was instruction, delivered without ceremony, without ego, and without mercy for mistakes, because mistakes in the Rockies did not wound pride, they ended lives. He taught Jeremiah that a cabin is not shelter if it does not face the wind correctly, that a rifle is useless if a man freezes before he can lift it, and that firewood stacked in excess and gathered months too early is worth more than nearly any other possession a man can carry. Under Bearclaw's guidance, Jeremiah learned that survival was not about reacting to danger, but about preventing it long before it appeared, about thinking in seasons rather than days, and about preparing for disasters that might never come, because the cost of preparation was always smaller than the cost of regret. He learned to read the mountains not as scenery, but as a living system, watching how animals moved before storms, how birds disappeared when weather turned, how silence itself could signal danger, and how the land always spoke quietly to those who were patient enough to listen. This education was not gentle, and it was not fast, because every lesson was paid for in blisters, hunger, wasted effort, and the lingering memory of that first winter which never fully released its grip on him, serving as a constant reminder of what happened when confidence arrived before understanding. As months passed, Jeremiah Johnson stopped trying to impose himself on the wilderness and began to adapt to it, adjusting his movements, his expectations, and even his thoughts, no longer seeing the mountains as an escape from the world, but as a place with its own laws, older and far less negotiable than those he had left behind. By the time the next winter approached, he was better prepared, not invincible, not fearless, but aware, carrying with him the knowledge that survival in the Rockies was not earned through boldness, but through humility, repetition, and respect. And yet, even as he learned the rules of nature, Jeremiah had not yet learned the rules of men, a lesson that would come later, and at a cost far greater than cold or hunger. For now, as the nights grew longer again and snow began its quiet return, he focused on the rhythms of preparation, stacking wood, drying meat, repairing his shelter, and settling into the deliberate, measured pace of a life shaped entirely by weather, silence, and patience. The mountains watched him, unmoved, as they always had. As years passed in the Rockies, time began to lose the sharp edges it once had. The days no longer measured by dates or plans, but by light and shadow, snowfall and thaw, hunger and rest. And Jeremiah Johnson slowly settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like existence. His cabin improved not through ambition but through repetition, each season teaching him something new about placement, insulation, and restraint, until the walls no longer fought the wind and the fire no longer felt like a fragile miracle, but a dependable companion through the long nights. He survived winter after winter, not without hardship, but without panic, his movements economical, his thoughts quieter, and his expectations aligned with the reality of the land. And in this steady isolation something unexpected happened, because the silence that had once pressed on him like a weight began to soften. It was during this period, when survival became routine rather than a daily gamble, that Jeremiah allowed himself a connection he had not planned for and had never truly believed possible, forming a family with a Native American woman whose presence brought a different kind of warmth into his life, one not measured in firewood or calories, but in shared labor, shared silence, and shared endurance. They lived simply, without illusions of permanence, and for a brief time it seemed as though Jeremiah had found a balance between solitude and belonging, a life where the mountains no longer felt like a prison, but a place where pain could finally rest without being constantly examined. The boy they adopted filled the cabin with small movements and quiet curiosity, reminding Jeremiah of the future in ways he had stopped allowing himself to imagine. And in those moments, brief and fragile as they were, the wilderness felt almost forgiving. But the frontier is patient, and it allows men to believe in peace just long enough for them to forget that peace is never guaranteed. Jeremiah had learned the laws of weather, the patterns of animals, and the requirements of survival, but he had not fully learned the invisible boundaries drawn by people, boundaries that did not appear on maps and did not shift with seasons, boundaries guarded not by storms, but by memory, belief, and obligation. When the lost settlers arrived, exhausted and frightened, Jeremiah recognized their desperation immediately, because he had once carried it himself, and against the quiet caution that had begun to guide his decisions, he agreed to help them, believing that experience and familiarity with the land made him capable of navigating any route safely. The path he chose was efficient, practical, and dangerous in a way that could not be measured by terrain alone, because it crossed ground that did not belong to him, ground that was sacred, marked not by fences or signs, but by meaning. He did not see the danger, and by the time he understood what he had done, the mistake was already moving through the mountains ahead of him, silent and irreversible. When Jeremiah returned to his cabin, the mountains offered no warning, no preparation, no sign of what waited for him there, because nature does not intervene in the affairs of men, and what he found was absence, destruction, and a silence that was different from all the others he had known. The fire was gone, the walls were ash, and the life he had built, carefully and patiently, had been erased in a single act that could not be undone. In that moment, the illusion of peace collapsed completely, and Jeremiah Johnson learned that survival in the wilderness does not protect a man from loss. It only teaches him how deeply he can endure it. The mountains stood unchanged, as they always did. After the destruction of his cabin, and the loss of everything that had quietly anchored him to the world, Jeremiah Johnson did not collapse, did not scream, and did not plead with the empty valleys for answers, because grief in the mountains does not announce itself loudly, it settles slowly, like snow, covering thought after thought until nothing familiar remains. He gathered what little the fire had not taken, moving with a calm that felt almost unnatural, his hands steady, his breath even, as though something inside him had gone still, as though the part of him capable of imagining a future had finally gone quiet. There was no question of leaving, because leaving would have required a destination, and Jeremiah Johnson no longer carried one, and so he stayed, not out of defiance or attachment, but because the mountains were the only place where the weight of what he had lost could exist without explanation. The war that followed did not begin with a declaration, and it did not unfold in open conflict, because this was not a war of armies or banners, but a slow, patient unraveling of boundaries, carried out in silence, over years, across ridges and frozen valleys that remembered every footstep. Jeremiah moved differently now, not with the cautious curiosity of a learner, but with the deliberate certainty of someone who no longer questioned the cost of his actions. His days measured by distance covered and nights by the discipline of staying alive, his rifle an extension of memory rather than intention. He did not hunt recklessly, nor did he seek confrontation for its own sake, because vengeance in the wilderness is not loud or chaotic. It is methodical, shaped by terrain, weather, and waiting. And Jeremiah understood, better than most, how time itself could be used as a weapon. Stories began to move through the mountains ahead of him, carried by trappers, traders, and campfire whispers, tales of a man who appeared and vanished without warning, who knew the passes before snow erased them, and who survived winters that claimed others without leaving a trace. They gave him a name that did not belong to him, a name shaped by fear and exaggeration, because legends are easier to understand than grief, and monsters are easier to explain than men who refuse to die. And so Jeremiah Johnson became something larger than himself, even as he retreated further into solitude. For more than a decade he lived this way, marked by scars rather than seasons, surviving summers of scarcity and winters of isolation, so complete that months could pass without the sound of another human voice, the silence stretching endlessly, broken only by wind, fire, and the slow movement of thought. Age began to settle into his body quietly, stiffness replacing speed, endurance replacing strength. But the mountains do not measure a man by his youth, only by his ability to adapt. And Jeremiah adapted as he always had, conserving energy, choosing movement carefully, and accepting limits without resistance. The world beyond the Rockies was changing, though it reached him only in fragments, carried by passing men who spoke of towns, roads, and borders being drawn where once there had been none. And while the frontier narrowed, Jeremiah remained, increasingly out of place in a landscape that was itself becoming a memory. When the final encounter came, it did not arrive as a climax, but as a pause, two men standing across from one another, neither reaching for a weapon, neither speaking, because there are moments where words and violence alike become unnecessary. What passed between them was not forgiveness, and it was not victory, but recognition, an understanding shaped by years of loss, endurance, and fatigue, an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing remained to be taken, and nothing could be returned. After that, the mountains felt quieter, not because danger had vanished, but because the struggle that had defined his existence had finally exhausted itself, leaving Jeremiah Johnson where he had always been, alone, surviving, and carrying the weight of every choice he had made. He did not seek redemption, because redemption suggests balance, and there was none to be found, only acceptance, slow and unadorned, settling into him, as naturally as the cold once had. And so he continued, not as a conqueror, not as a hero, but as a man who endured, moving through a world that no longer needed him, yet did not take him either. Time moved differently for Jeremiah Johnson as the years accumulated, not as a sequence of milestones, but as a gradual softening of urgency, a slow erosion of anger, and a quiet narrowing of the world to what could be seen, felt, and carried without effort. The mountains were changing, though not in ways that were immediately visible from a ridge or a frozen valley, because change in the frontier did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with absence. Fewer trappers passing through, fewer fires on the horizon at night, fewer stories traded for supplies, until silence no longer felt chosen, but inherited. Jeremiah felt the years most clearly in his body, in the stiffness that lingered after cold nights, in the way injuries healed more slowly, and in the careful calculations he now made before each movement, because survival had taught him not to resist age, but to adapt to it, just as he had adapted to snow, hunger, and isolation. The world beyond the Rockies pressed closer with each season. Roads cut through valleys that had once belonged only to animals and weather. Towns rose where trading posts once stood alone, and boundaries appeared where there had once been only understanding. And while Jeremiah did not seek these changes, he could not fully escape them either. Men spoke of laws and ownership, of land measured and divided, of a future that no longer had room for those who lived between definitions. And Jeremiah listened without argument, because argument required belief in a direction forward, and he had long since learned to exist without one. He was becoming a remnant of something that no longer existed, not just a mountain man, but a witness to a way of living that depended on patience, restraint, and the acceptance of limits, qualities that did not survive easily in a world that valued speed and certainty. There were moments, rare and quiet, when memory returned without warning. The image of a cabin warm with shared labor, a small presence moving near the fire, a sense of belonging that had once seemed permanent. And in those moments, Jeremiah did not push the thoughts away, because he had learned that grief does not fade by force, only by being carried gently over time. The winters continued, though they no longer felt like challenges to be overcome, but like familiar companions, each one requiring preparation, conservation, and respect, each one reminding him that survival was still possible, even if meaning remained elusive. He did not ask what waited beyond the next season, because questions had stopped offering comfort long ago, and instead focused on what remained within reach: fire, shelter, food, and the quiet discipline of staying alive without expecting reward. The mountains did not offer him closure, nor did they offer explanation, because nature does not resolve the stories of men. It simply allows them to continue until they cannot. And Jeremiah Johnson understood this with a clarity that no longer frightened him. He had survived not because he had mastered the land, but because he had learned when to move, when to wait, and when to accept loss without turning away from it. And this understanding, hard-earned and incomplete, became the shape of his remaining years. And so he remained, an old figure moving slowly through a landscape that remembered him even as it forgot the world that had sent him there, living not toward an ending, but through each day as it came, steady, quiet, and unresolved. As the seasons continued to pass, Jeremiah Johnson learned to live inside time rather than against it, allowing days to unfold without expectation, without anticipation, and without the need to name them, because names belonged to calendars and calendars belonged to a world that no longer shaped his life. Morning came not as a beginning, but as a gradual brightening of cold air, the pale light filtering through frost-covered branches, revealing the quiet geometry of snowdrifts shaped by wind rather than intention. And Jeremiah would sit for long moments before moving, listening to the subtle signals of the mountains, the way the cold settled differently on certain days, the way the forest held its breath before a storm. He no longer rushed tasks because haste had no place here, and everything he did was governed by an internal rhythm built slowly over years of repetition, stacking wood with movements that wasted no strength, checking traps not by schedule but by weather, and repairing what needed repair long before it threatened to fail. The cabin, once fragile and temporary, had become an extension of his understanding, its walls shaped by trial and correction rather than design, each improvement the result of something once done wrong, each reinforcement a memory of cold endured and learned from, until shelter no longer felt like something he occupied, but something he inhabited. There were days when he spoke aloud, not because he expected an answer, but because the sound of his own voice grounded him in the present, reminding him that he still existed as something more than movement and breath. And there were days when silence felt so complete that even thought slowed, stretching out like the long shadows cast across snow at dusk. Food was never abundant, but it was sufficient. Dried meat measured carefully, small meals eaten without distraction, because hunger taught discipline and excess invited carelessness, and Jeremiah had learned, through seasons of scarcity, that survival favored moderation rather than comfort. When storms arrived, they did not bring fear, only attention, the careful sealing of gaps, the management of firewood, the conservation of movement, and the quiet acceptance that the world beyond the cabin would disappear for a time, leaving only a small circle of warmth and light suspended in a vast white stillness. During these long stretches, memory surfaced unpredictably, not as sharp pain but as a dull presence, the awareness of something that had once existed and no longer did, and Jeremiah allowed these thoughts to pass without resistance, understanding that forgetting was neither possible nor necessary. The mountains did not ask him to explain himself, and this absence of judgment became a form of relief, because explanation belonged to society, to courts, to history, and here there was only consequence, simple and immediate, tied directly to action. Occasionally, Another man passed through, a trapper, a hunter, someone moving between places rather than settling into them, and exchanges were brief, functional, and quiet. Information traded without curiosity, because curiosity implied attachment, and attachment was something Jeremiah no longer reached for. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing fragments of a world that felt increasingly distant, changes that arrived softened by distance and time, names of places growing larger, borders growing firmer, and ways of living growing narrower. But these things brushed past him without urgency, like weather observed from indoors. What mattered remained close and tangible: the condition of his hands, the behavior of animals, the sound of ice shifting at night, and the small but essential rituals that structured his days without drawing attention to themselves. He did not consider himself lonely in the way people once had, because loneliness required comparison, and comparison required memory of something better, and while memory still existed, it no longer demanded resolution. Instead, there was a steady companionship with the land itself, not affection, not harmony, but familiarity. The understanding that every place carries its own dangers and its own allowances, and that survival meant knowing the difference without resentment. As another winter approached, announced quietly by the changing angle of light, and the first frost forming where water once ran freely, Jeremiah prepared as he always did, methodically, without drama, because preparation was not an act of hope, but of respect. The mountains remained indifferent and immense, and within them, Jeremiah Johnson continued, not as a legend, not as a warning, but simply as a man moving carefully through a world that asked nothing of him except that he pay attention. As winter settled in again, not suddenly, but through a series of small, almost polite warnings, Jeremiah Johnson adjusted without conscious thought, responding to the mountains the way one responds to breathing, instinctively and without ceremony, because adaptation had long ago replaced intention. The first deep cold arrived at night, slipping into the cabin as a thin, persistent presence, testing joints, wood, and memory, and Jeremiah responded by adding another layer of insulation, another armful of wood, another small correction learned from winters past. Each adjustment a quiet acknowledgement that survival was never finished, only maintained. Days shortened until light became something borrowed rather than expected, a narrow window in which movement mattered, and he learned to let darkness arrive without resistance, because fighting the night wasted energy, and energy was something the mountains always demanded be accounted for. Inside the cabin, the fire became a steady companion rather than a comfort, its maintenance a task performed slowly and deliberately, because rushing risked mistakes, and mistakes in winter carried weight far beyond inconvenience. There were long stretches when he remained indoors, listening to the sound of wind pressing against the walls, the occasional shifting crack of frozen timber, and the subtle changes in silence that signaled storms moving through valleys he could not see. And in these moments time stretched, thinning into something almost weightless. Thoughts drifted without urgency, sometimes circling old memories, sometimes dissolving entirely, leaving only awareness, the simple recognition of warmth, breath, and continued existence. And Jeremiah did not attempt to guide these thoughts, because guidance implied purpose, and purpose had become unnecessary. Hunger was present but muted, managed carefully through small, regular meals, because fullness dulled attention, and attention was the difference between comfort and risk. And so he ate just enough, conserving both food and clarity. When storms passed and the world briefly revealed itself again, Jeremiah moved cautiously, reading snow patterns, checking traps that often yielded little, and returning without frustration, because expectation had been replaced by acceptance, and acceptance made disappointment irrelevant. He spoke less now, even to himself, because language felt heavy in the cold, and silence carried information words could not. The way snow reflected sound, the way animals avoided certain paths, the way the air itself seemed to thicken before deeper freezes. Occasionally he noticed the passage of time in small, unremarkable ways, a tool worn smooth from years of use, a path less visible than it once was, a task taking slightly longer than it used to, and he acknowledged these changes without judgment, because judgment required comparison, and comparison required a different life. The mountains did not demand strength from him anymore, only consistency, and he offered it willingly, because consistency was something he could provide without questioning why. At night, as the fire settled into a steady glow and shadows stretched across the walls, Jeremiah lay still, listening to the rhythm of the cabin, the quiet breathing of a place that had learned how to endure, and sleep came not as escape, but as continuation, another state of existing within the same unbroken flow. Outside, snow continued to fall, reshaping the world without concern for what had been there before, and Jeremiah Johnson remained within it, moving slowly, thinking less, and surviving in a way that no longer felt like resistance, but like alignment. And so the winter deepened, quietly, patiently, without asking whether he was ready. There were mornings when Jeremiah Johnson woke before light, not because he planned to, but because the cold itself seemed to pull him gently back into awareness, the kind of cold that does not shock but insists, reminding the body that warmth must be earned anew each day. He would lie still for long moments, listening to the quiet creaks of the cabin as the wood adjusted to the temperature, the faint hiss of embers beneath ash, and the deep, uninterrupted silence outside, a silence so complete that it felt almost physical, pressing inward rather than merely surrounding him. Getting up was never rushed, because haste wasted heat, and heat was the most precious currency he possessed. So he moved slowly, deliberately, feeding the fire just enough to revive it, watching flames grow without impatience, allowing warmth to return gradually to hands and joints that had stiffened overnight. Water was collected with care, ice chipped patiently, melted slowly, because every task in winter took twice the time it seemed it should, and Jeremiah had learned long ago that frustration had no practical value here, only consequence. When he stepped outside, the world appeared stripped of detail, reduced to form and contrast, white slopes and dark trees, sky and ground blending together, until distance became difficult to judge, and he paused each time, letting his eyes adjust, letting the land reveal itself rather than assuming he understood it. Movement through deep snow was economical, each step placed with intention, because wasted effort accumulated silently, and exhaustion did not announce itself until it was already dangerous. And Jeremiah listened closely to his body, not as something to conquer, but as something to manage. Sometimes he followed familiar paths, routes pressed into the snow by repetition rather than design, and sometimes he chose not to move at all, because stillness was also a form of survival, conserving strength, conserving heat, conserving thought. Inside the cabin, daylight passed slowly, marked not by clocks but by the changing angle of light on the wall, and when darkness arrived it did so fully, without the soft transitions of towns or cities, leaving only firelight and shadow, and the quiet knowledge that the world beyond the walls had disappeared again. In these long evenings, Jeremiah repaired tools, sharpened blades, and adjusted small details that might never matter, not because they were urgent, but because attention itself was a discipline, a way of staying present in a life where distraction could be fatal. There were moments when memory surfaced uninvited, not sharply, but gently, like distant terrain glimpsed through falling snow, and he allowed it to remain without engaging it, understanding that memory did not need resolution to be endured. Sleep came in segments rather than stretches, waking and returning without anxiety, because the mountains had taught him that rest did not have to be complete to be sufficient, only consistent. Outside, the wind reshaped the landscape continuously, erasing yesterday's tracks, covering yesterday's decisions, reminding him that nothing here was permanent except change itself, and Jeremiah accepted this without resentment. Another day passed, indistinguishable from the last, and yet entirely its own, carrying its own risks, its own adjustments, its own quiet victories. Within that repetition, Jeremiah Johnson continued, not waiting for anything, not moving toward anything, simply existing within the slow, patient rhythm of survival. And the mountains, vast and unmoved, allowed him to remain. There were days when the sky remained the same color from morning until night. A flat, pale ceiling pressing down on the mountains, making distance feel uncertain and time feel suspended. And Jeremiah Johnson learned not to interpret these days as good or bad, only as conditions to be understood and respected. On such days he stayed close to the cabin, not out of fear but out of calculation, knowing that visibility mattered less than energy, and that wandering simply to feel movement often led to mistakes that served no purpose. The world outside seemed quieter than usual, snow absorbing sound until even the wind felt distant. And in that quiet Jeremiah became more aware of small things. The rhythm of his breathing, the way his boots compressed the snow differently, depending on temperature, the faint smell of smoke clinging to his clothes long after the fire had settled. He checked his supplies without urgency, counting not to reassure himself, but to remain familiar with what he had, because familiarity reduced surprise, and surprise was rarely harmless in winter. Food was handled carefully, never wasted, never rushed, each bite eaten slowly, not as a pleasure, but as a necessary continuation of effort. And he noticed how the body adapted, how hunger softened into something manageable, how desire narrowed until only function remained. There were afternoons when light lingered just long enough to invite movement, and Jeremiah stepped outside to adjust a trap, clear a path, or simply confirm that the world still existed beyond the walls, his presence leaving temporary marks that he knew would be erased by morning. The act of returning inside carried its own quiet satisfaction, not relief exactly, but recognition, the sense that boundaries had been respected, that risk had been measured and contained rather than tested. Inside, the cabin held warmth unevenly, pockets of heat and cold shifting as the fire burned, and Jeremiah moved between them instinctively, positioning himself where comfort required the least effort, because effort itself was a resource. Sometimes he sat without task, hands resting, eyes unfocused, allowing thought to slow until it barely formed words, until awareness became something simpler, a steady acknowledgement of being present, of continuing. Night arrived early, darkness filling the spaces between objects, softening edges, and Jeremiah adjusted the fire again, not to make it bright, but to make it last, because endurance mattered more than intensity. Sleep followed its own pattern, light and intermittent, woven between waking moments, and he accepted this without resistance, because resistance belonged to a different life, one structured by expectation rather than necessity. Outside, the mountains held their shape, unchanged and unconcerned, carrying storms and silence with equal indifference, and within them Jeremiah Johnson continued, not seeking meaning, not escaping memory, but moving steadily through another unremarkable day that quietly demanded everything he had learned. And the rhythm persisted, unbroken, patient, and unresolved. There were moments, usually in the middle of the day when light was weakest and the cold most settled, when Jeremiah Johnson became acutely aware of how small his life had become, not in a way that frightened him, but in a way that clarified everything, because smallness here meant focus, and focus meant survival. He learned to measure effort not by distance but by consequence, understanding that a single unnecessary movement could echo through the day as fatigue, and fatigue could echo through the night as cold, and cold could echo into the morning as hesitation, a chain he had no interest in beginning. The fire demanded constant but gentle attention, not fed aggressively, not neglected, just enough to maintain balance, and Jeremiah treated it the way he treated everything else now, as something that required respect rather than control. Smoke settled into the cabin's beams, darkening the wood over time, marking the passage of years more reliably than memory ever could, and Jeremiah noticed this without sentiment, aware that even shelter carried the marks of endurance. When he stepped outside, breath crystallized instantly, hanging for a moment before dissolving, and he found himself pausing to watch it, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, because observation had become second nature, a quiet check that everything still functioned as it should. Tracks appeared and vanished without pattern, sometimes animal, sometimes his own, and he read them not as signs of opportunity, but as information, neutral and fleeting, reminders that movement continued whether he participated or not. There were days when wind moved through the trees without sound, bending branches under the weight of snow, and days when it howled endlessly, testing every seam and joint, and Jeremiah adapted to both with the same restrained response, adjusting, sealing, waiting. Inside, he maintained tools with care that bordered on reverence, because tools represented stored effort, past labor preserved for future need, and keeping them ready was a way of honoring time already spent. He no longer thought in terms of weeks or seasons, only in states of readiness, asking silently whether he had enough warmth, enough food, enough strength to continue without borrowing from tomorrow. Thoughts came and went without urgency, sometimes forming fragments of older lives, sometimes dissolving entirely into sensation, the feel of rough wood beneath his fingers, the sound of snow sliding from the roof, the steady pulse of his own breathing. At night, the cabin existed as a small island of order within an immense unlit expanse, and Jeremiah accepted the contrast without emotion, because emotion was no longer necessary for understanding. Sleep arrived when it did, light and shallow, and when he woke he did not question it, rising only when warmth allowed, remaining still when it did not. Because patience was no longer something he practiced, it was something he embodied. Another day unfolded without distinction, neither easier nor harder than the last. And within that sameness Jeremiah Johnson continued, not advancing, not retreating, simply maintaining alignment with a world that asked nothing beyond attention and restraint. The mountains remained vast and unmoved, and within them the quiet persistence of a single life carried on, steady and unresolved, like the winter itself. There were stretches of time when even effort seemed to dissolve, when Jeremiah Johnson existed almost entirely in response, waking, moving, eating, resting, without attaching meaning to any of it, because meaning required distance, and distance no longer existed between him and the life he lived. The cold shaped everything, not as an enemy but as a condition that defined limits, narrowing choices until only the essential remained, and Jeremiah found a strange clarity in that narrowing, because when options disappear, doubt often goes with them. He noticed how the body learned on its own, fingers stiffening less quickly, breath finding a rhythm that conserved warmth, muscles remembering how to move without waste, and he allowed these changes to happen without comment, trusting experience more than intention. There were afternoons when the sky darkened early, clouds pressing low against the ridges, and Jeremiah chose not to light the fire right away, waiting instead, letting the cabin cool gradually, understanding that patience delayed consumption, and consumption always demanded repayment. When the fire was finally fed, it was done sparingly, flame catching slowly, the glow spreading just enough to reclaim the space without overwhelming it, because excess heat dulled awareness, and awareness was something he protected carefully. He listened to the mountains not with expectation, but with familiarity, recognizing the subtle difference between a storm that would pass and one that would settle in, the way wind shifted direction before snowfall thickened, the way silence itself deepened when the world prepared to close. There were times when he stood at the doorway, looking out without stepping forward, allowing the landscape to exist without his presence, because observation alone satisfied the need to confirm that nothing had changed beyond necessity. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, wood, and cold fabric, a scent that had become so constant it no longer registered as smell, only as background. And Jeremiah understood that this too was adaptation, the quiet erasure of distraction. His hands moved over familiar surfaces, tools worn smooth, edges maintained without urgency, and each small act felt complete in itself, not leading anywhere, not preparing for something greater, just existing as part of a continuous sequence. At night, When wind pressed against the walls or snow slid from the roof in slow, heavy movements, Jeremiah remained still, listening, counting breaths without numbers, allowing the sounds to pass through him without interpretation. Sleep came in layers, thin and uneven, and he accepted waking as easily as rest, because both were simply states within the same ongoing process. Neither preferred, neither resisted. Another cycle completed itself without marking time, another quiet agreement formed between man and land, and Jeremiah Johnson continued within it, unchanged and yet constantly adjusting, held in place by habit, awareness, and the absence of expectation. The mountains did not respond, and they did not need to. Some days passed without leaving a clear memory behind, dissolving into one another until Jeremiah Johnson could no longer separate one from the next. And he did not try to, because separation implied importance, and importance no longer served him here. The light shifted almost imperceptibly, thinning in the mornings, lingering a little longer in the afternoons, and he registered these changes without assigning them meaning, knowing only that the mountains were moving through another phase of themselves, and that he would move with them, as he always had. He adjusted his routines slightly, not out of planning but out of habit refined by years, waking when the cold insisted, resting when movement offered no advantage, and letting the day unfold without resistance, because resistance wasted energy and energy was always finite. There were moments when he stood outside longer than necessary, not to go anywhere, but to feel the air settle around him, the way cold wrapped the body evenly when one stopped moving, and he would remain still until sensation sharpened just enough to remind him to return indoors. Inside the cabin, time felt thicker, slowed by warmth and shadow, and Jeremiah found himself sitting quietly, hands idle, eyes half-focused, allowing awareness to narrow until it held only the fire, the walls, and the steady presence of breath. He did not think of himself as waiting, because waiting implies an arrival, and nothing was arriving here, only continuing, and continuation was something he understood well. Food was prepared in small, deliberate actions, eaten slowly, not for comfort but for balance, because balance was what kept the body steady and the mind clear, and clarity, even without direction, was preferable to hunger-driven urgency. Occasionally he noticed sounds beyond the usual pattern, a distant shift of snow, the brief movement of an animal, and he acknowledged these without pursuit, because observation alone often provided enough information. The cabin bore the marks of many winters, wood darkened by smoke, joints reinforced quietly over time, and Jeremiah moved within it as one moves within a familiar thought, without examining each detail, trusting that everything remained where it should be. Night arrived without announcement, darkness filling the spaces gently, and he adjusted the fire once more, not to brighten the room, but to steady it, because steadiness mattered more than light. As he lay down, sleep did not feel like escape or rest, but like another form of stillness, and he allowed it to come and go without concern, waking and drifting again as the body required. Outside, the mountains continued their slow, indifferent presence, holding cold silence and distance without effort, and within that vastness Jeremiah Johnson remained, unhurried, unresolved, and quietly aligned with a life that no longer asked him to be anything more than attentive. And the rhythm carried on, unchanged, patient, and open-ended. There were nights when the cold seemed to pause just outside the walls, not retreating, not advancing, simply waiting, and Jeremiah Johnson sensed this instinctively, adjusting the fire only slightly, because too much warmth invited waste, and waste was something the mountains always reclaimed. He listened to the way the cabin responded to temperature, the faint tightening of wood, the subtle shifts that signaled balance or imbalance, and over time these sounds became as familiar as breath, another language he no longer had to translate. Morning returned gradually, light filtering in without urgency, and Jeremiah rose when his body allowed it, not forcing movement, not delaying it, because forcing and delaying were both forms of resistance, and resistance had long ago lost its usefulness. Outside, the air felt heavier than usual, snow packed densely underfoot, each step producing a muted compression rather than a sound, and he adjusted his pace accordingly, knowing that dense snow held cold longer and fatigue more quickly. He did not travel far, only far enough to confirm that paths remained passable, that nothing had shifted dangerously during the night, and then he returned, because confirmation was often more valuable than exploration. Inside again, he tended to small tasks that never truly ended, checking seams, smoothing rough edges, maintaining the quiet order that allowed him to move without thought, because thought was slower than habit, and habit had kept him alive. There were moments when he stood still, hands resting against the table, eyes unfocused, allowing sensation to replace narrative, the warmth of the fire on one side, the cold seeping through the walls on the other, and within that balance he felt steady. Memory did not intrude sharply anymore, but lingered faintly, like terrain remembered rather than revisited, and Jeremiah did not chase it away, because memory had become another weather pattern, present, but no longer commanding. The day moved on without marking itself. Tasks completed not because they were scheduled, but because they were necessary, and necessity had become the only structure his life required. As darkness returned, he prepared for it without ceremony, reducing movement, conserving fuel, settling into the familiar stillness that night demanded, and he accepted the narrowing of the world without regret. Sleep arrived lightly, fragment by fragment, and when he woke he did not question why, remaining still until warmth returned, then drifting again, because this rhythm had proven sufficient, and sufficiency was all that mattered. Outside, the mountains held their silence, vast and unresponsive, and within that silence, Jeremiah Johnson continued, unremarkable, enduring, and quietly present, moving through another stretch of time that did not ask to be remembered, and the slow, patient rhythm carried on. There were hours when even the concept of weather seemed to fade, when snow and sky blended so completely that the world felt suspended, neither moving forward nor retreating, and Jeremiah Johnson existed within that suspension without discomfort, because stillness had become familiar. He found himself pausing more often, not because he was tired, but because pausing allowed the body to stay aligned with the cold, letting warmth settle where it was needed, letting breath slow until it matched the quiet around him. The cabin no longer felt small, because size had lost relevance, and instead it felt sufficient, holding exactly what was required and nothing more, a space shaped by necessity rather than desire, and Jeremiah moved within it with minimal motion, conserving effort without consciously trying to. He noticed how the sound of fire changed as wood aged, how older logs burned differently, slower and steadier, and he chose them carefully, understanding that even fuel carried a history that mattered. Outside, the landscape offered no invitation, only presence, and Jeremiah accepted that presence without interpretation, stepping into it only when needed, retreating without regret when it was not. There were moments when he rested against the wall, eyes closed but not sleeping, simply allowing the body to remain upright, listening to the faint rhythm of blood moving through chilled limbs, grounding himself in sensation rather than thought. Hunger arrived quietly now, no longer sharp, more like a reminder than a demand, and he responded to it calmly, preparing food without anticipation, eating without distraction, because nourishment was part of maintenance, not pleasure. The passage of time revealed itself in subtle ways, a tool wearing thin, a repair lasting longer than expected, the fire needing slightly more attention than it once did, and Jeremiah acknowledged these changes without concern, adjusting as he always had. When night returned, it did so without drama, darkness filling the cabin gradually, and he adjusted the fire one last time, not seeking warmth so much as balance, because balance had become the central measure of all things. Sleep drifted in and out, light and incomplete, and he allowed it to do so, understanding that rest did not have to be deep to be effective, only regular and unforced. Beyond the walls, the mountains remained unchanged, holding cold, silence and distance without effort, and within that vast stillness Jeremiah Johnson continued, unhurried, attentive and present, moving through another stretch of existence that required nothing more than what he already knew. And so the quiet carried on, steady and unresolved, like breath in cold air. There were days when Jeremiah Johnson barely marked his own movements, when the body seemed to carry itself from task to task without instruction, guided by a familiarity so deep it no longer required thought, and in those days he felt less like a man making decisions and more like a presence moving within conditions already accepted. The cold no longer announced itself sharply. It simply existed, settled into the world like a constant pressure shaping posture, pace and attention. And Jeremiah responded to it without emotion, adjusting layers, slowing gestures, allowing warmth to be preserved rather than chased. He learned to recognize the moments when doing nothing was the most effective action, when remaining still conserved more strength than movement ever could, and he embraced these pauses fully, sitting quietly, letting time move around him instead of through him. Inside the cabin, the air held layers of past fires, faint traces of smoke embedded in the wood, and Jeremiah breathed it in without noticing, because it had become part of the background of his existence, as familiar as the grain of the table beneath his hands. There were afternoons when light slipped in at a low angle, illuminating dust and ash suspended briefly before settling again, and he watched this without curiosity, simply acknowledging that the world continued to behave as it always had. He tended to small imperfections when he noticed them, a loose joint, a worn edge, a place where cold crept in more easily than before, not because these things threatened him immediately, but because attention paid early prevented struggle later. The mountains outside did not feel distant, nor did they feel close. They simply were, holding their shape without regard for observation. And Jeremiah felt no need to test them, content to exist at their edge, rather than within their depths. When he stepped out briefly, the cold wrapped around him evenly, and he stood still for a moment, allowing sensation to settle before moving again, because abruptness belonged to warmer places, and here smooth transitions mattered. Thoughts drifted slowly, often without forming complete ideas, dissolving into awareness of sound, texture, and rhythm, and Jeremiah allowed this, understanding that thinking less did not mean understanding less, only understanding differently. As evening approached, he adjusted his routine subtly, conserving fuel, reducing movement, preparing for the narrowing of the world that night always brought, and he did so without conscious planning, because preparation had long ago become instinct. Sleep arrived quietly, sometimes shallow, sometimes deeper, and he accepted both states without preference, because both allowed continuation, and continuation was the only measure that remained relevant. Outside, snow settled softly, reshaping the land without concern for memory or effort. And within that reshaping, Jeremiah Johnson continued, steady, restrained and present, carried forward by habit, awareness, and the simple refusal to stop. And the quiet endured, unbroken, patient and open, like the mountains themselves. There were intervals when Jeremiah Johnson could not have said whether it was morning or afternoon without stepping outside, because inside the cabin time softened, losing its edges, becoming something felt rather than measured. And he allowed that softness to remain, understanding that certainty was not required to continue. He noticed how cold behaved differently on different days, sometimes sharp and immediate, sometimes dull and persistent. And he adjusted without commentary, because the body learned faster than thought ever could, and he trusted that learning completely. The act of tending the fire became almost ceremonial, not in reverence, but in repetition. The careful placement of wood, the measured attention to flame, the patience to let warmth build slowly, rather than demanding it all at once. When he sat fully, not preparing for the next movement, not anticipating interruption, just occupying the moment until it passed on its own, and this stillness no longer felt like waiting, but like alignment. Outside, snow accumulated in layers that disguised change, making the world appear unchanged even as it transformed continuously, and Jeremiah understood this intuitively, recognizing that stability here was always temporary, always conditional. He stepped out only when necessary, and when he did, he moved smoothly, avoiding sudden gestures because smoothness conserved heat and reduced risk, and risk was something he managed quietly rather than challenged. There were moments when he rested his hand against the doorframe, feeling the contrast between warmth and cold, inside and outside, and he lingered there briefly, acknowledging the boundary without crossing it unnecessarily. Food remained simple and functional, prepared without urgency, consumed without excess, and he noticed how the body responded best to regularity rather than abundance, how steadiness preserved strength better than indulgence ever could. The cabin carried the weight of many winters now, each beam holding a record of endurance, each repair layered over the last, and Jeremiah moved within that history without reflection, because reflection belonged to stories, and he was no longer telling one. As darkness returned, he reduced the world again to its essentials: fire, shelter, rest, and he accepted the narrowing without resistance, because narrowing was what made continuation possible. Sleep came and went in quiet waves, and he drifted with it, waking when cold or sound required attention, resting again when balance returned, never questioning the rhythm, because the rhythm had proven itself sufficient. Beyond the walls, the mountains remained vast, indifferent, and unchanged, and within that indifference Jeremiah Johnson continued, unhurried, unresolved and present, moving through another stretch of time that asked nothing more than awareness and restraint. And so the quiet went on, steady and unbroken, like breath in the cold air. In the end, there was no single moment that marked the conclusion of Jeremiah Johnson's life in the mountains. No final test, no last great winter, no dramatic crossing from endurance into silence, because endings in the Rockies rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, folded into routine, disguised as just another day. He continued as he always had, adjusting, conserving, paying attention, until effort itself began to thin, until movements took longer to complete, and required more rest between them, and he accepted this without resistance, because resistance had never changed outcomes here, only costs. The mountains did not push him away, nor did they claim him suddenly, they simply remained, vast and indifferent, allowing time to do what it always does, wearing everything down evenly, without judgment, without haste. There were fewer reasons to move far from the cabin now, and Jeremiah no longer felt compelled to, content to exist within a smaller circle of warmth, familiarity and silence, where the world could be understood without explanation. Memory no longer arrived sharply, and when it came, it carried no demand to be resolved, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been lived, endured, and carried long enough to lose its weight. The fire burned lower than it once had, fed more sparingly, not out of fear of scarcity, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had guided him through storms, hunger, and isolation, and he watched it without expectation, letting it be what it was. Outside, snow continued to fall, erase and reshape, just as it always had, covering tracks, softening edges, returning the land to itself again and again, indifferent to how many winters had passed or who remained to witness them. Jeremiah Johnson did not leave the mountains, and the mountains did not take him in any dramatic sense, because he had long since become part of their quiet accounting, another life lived within their rules, another presence that learned to endure without asking to be remembered. And so his story did not end with triumph or redemption, but with continuation fading gently into stillness. A man who survived not to be celebrated, but to exist as long as existence was possible, and who accepted at last that this was enough. The Rockies remained silent and immense, and the space where Jeremiah Johnson had lived slowly returned to quiet, as it always does, holding no record, offering no judgment, only the steady, unbroken calm of a world that continues long after stories fall asleep. And in that calm, the fire dimmed, the wind passed, and the mountains endured,